Hello again. The American Armed Services have for many years had a possibly undeserved reputation for being inadvertently responsible for more friendly fire casualties than most countries. A rather unkind joke went around during the Second World War to this effect: when the English fly over, the Germans duck. When the Germans fly over, the English duck. When the Americans fly over, everyone ducks. This might not have been quite so amusing to the Swiss during the Second World War, of course, because America was always bombing their country by mistake through navigational errors and so on. It began on April Fool's Day 1944 when 54 American bombers flew into Switzerland and bombed the town of Schaffhausen. That killed over 100 people. The Swiss complained furiously about this, but it didn't really make any difference. For the next year, American bombers used to fly over Switzerland and bomb the country on a routine basis. Switzerland was, of course, neutral during the Second World War. All this culminated in March 1945, when the American Air Force managed to bomb Zurich, of all unlikely things. The most awful and little known friendly fire incident of the Second World War took place on 7th of December 1941. The Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on the 7th of December 1941, the date that Roosevelt said would live in infamy, is of enormous significance to most Americans. The long-term consequences of Pearl Harbor have been immense, of course. It meant that the traditional American policy of isolationism was abandoned for many years. The images of the burning warships live on in the mind of most people in America. That being so, it might seem a little tactless to point out that it was also the day on which America's armed forces somehow managed to kill more American citizens than they did attacking Japanese airmen. This is a story which is not immediately accessible, even on the internet. Wikipedia, for example, on their article about the attack on Pearl Harbor, says that there were 2008 sailors were killed, 218 soldiers, 109 Marines, and 68 civilians. It goes on to mention that 55 Japanese airmen were also killed. Putting those civilians alongside the American military casualties obviously suggests that they too were victims of the Japanese. They weren't, they were actually friendly fire casualties. These pictures show some of the damage inflicted on Honolulu, which is only 4 or 5 miles away from Pearl Harbor. The material damage, the buildings destroyed, as well as the men, women and children killed that day on the 7th of December, had nothing to do with Japanese bombs. Pearl Harbor was defended by a number of anti-aircraft batteries, but an exercise lasting a week had been carried out to show their defensiveness between the 30th of November and the 6th of December. It had all gone so well that the military had decided to give the anti-aircraft crews some leave, told them they could go off to Honolulu. So on the 7th of December, when the Japanese attacked, there were no crew for the anti-aircraft guns and all the ammunition had been locked away, which is very imprudent. This meant that when the Japanese dive bombers, which had been launched from nearby aircraft carriers, began attacking, none of the AA guns could respond. It was left to the sailors on the ships to decide what to do, and all they had at their disposal to defend themselves from the Japanese dive bombers was 5-inch naval guns, the kind that we can see here on a ship. Now, if you're fighting another ship or you wish to bombard the shore from your own ship, nothing more useful than these large guns can be found. They throw shells weighing 55 pounds, that's about 25 kilograms, which is really heavy, to say the least of it. They could be used against aeroplanes, some of them. There was a dual purpose form of 5-inch gun with time fuses that could be fitted onto the shells, could be adjusted. But that was no use at all under this circumstance, because the Japanese planes were literally right on top of the ships. There would be no point setting a delay fuse for 10 seconds or 12 seconds or something of that sort. The planes were coming in so low that the only hope was to fire directly at them with ordinary shells which would explode on impact. Now, aeroplanes are fast moving objects and they're relatively small, so the chances of any individual shell striking one when you fire at an aeroplane is very low. Most of the shells missed. Those that were fired east were aimed at a low, very shallow, low angle, like so, because the planes were so low, and they flew only a few miles before coming to Earth and exploding. The consequence was that Honolulu was shelled ferociously for much of that morning, with 55-pound shells exploding across the entire city. It's worth mentioning, by the way, that the Japanese didn't have any interest at all in bombing civilians that day. This was a purely military operation. It was a surgical strike to disable the US Navy. They had no interest in wasting bombs on the city of Honolulu at all. To give one example of the sort of casualties that were caused that day, 48-year-old Jitsuo Hirosaki ran a restaurant in Honolulu. He had his 3 children with him at work that morning, the youngest of whom was 2 years old. There were a lot of young men there, some from a Christian youth organisation, also eating breakfast in the restaurant that day. A 55-pound shell flew through the window and exploded right in the middle of the restaurant. Jitsuo Hirosaki was killed, so were his 3 children. Their 14-year-old cousin was killed, and 7 of the young men also died. Elsewhere, another 50 or so civilians were killed that morning. Most of the American citizens in Honolulu at that time were Japanese American. It wasn't in anybody's interest during the war itself to admit what had happened. Because most of the dead were Japanese American, this was something of a propaganda coup for the Americans. I mean, they could say, in effect, well, look how cold-hearted the Japanese are. They don't even mind killing their own people. The friendly fire disasters weren't over really for that day, because the sailors were twitchy and they kept shooting at clouds and shadows throughout the morning. So shells continued to fall on Honolulu that morning. Later that day, 6 American aircraft, which had come from American aircraft carriers, sought permission to land at Pearl Harbor. They radioed Pearl Harbor, they were given permission to land. Everybody knew that American planes were coming in, but nevertheless, as they came in for the final approach, a huge anti-aircraft barrage started and 5 of the 6 planes were shot down. After the war, the American government paid compensation to those who had lost homes or had relatives killed during Pearl Harbor. But even to this day, the circumstances which led the Navy to kill more of their own citizens than they did Japanese airmen that day isn't really at all well known.